this is a great crowd tonight. Thank you all for coming out. I certainly appreciate it. I know friends of the Gorge appreciates it. So the Gorge is a remarkable place, and it is remarkable for so many reasons. And there are two reasons in particular, I think. The world-class scenic, natural, cultural, recreational resources, and the proximity of these resources to a major metropolitan area. It is unusual in this country. It's really unusual across the world. And these same qualities made the Gorge a very attractive place for developers, as you can imagine. And the first major development proposal, at least I'm aware of, happened 100 years ago, and this would have been in around 1910. And we think of this because you can see what turned into the Scenic Highway is actually below Crown Point in this image. But 100 years ago, this was a proposal for Columbia Highlands Scenic Homes. And it includes the highest elevator in the world, golf links and polo grounds, a hotel, and a power plant. And if you look, there is the highest elevator in the world, going up to Angel's Rest, for those of you who are familiar with it in the Western Gorge. That takes you to the polo grounds and the golf links. And if you'd like, you can stay at a hotel on what's on top of now Devil's Rest. And of course, you need electricity to power all this. So there was a new power plant at Wakena Falls. Fortunately, this didn't happen. But what did happen was a pattern that really played out over the course of the next century. And it was about every 20 years, what we would see would be improved access to the Gorge, followed by new development proposals, followed by efforts of protection. And unfortunately, the efforts of protection usually fell short. But we saw this in 1914, the Scenic Highway was completed. And this was the access that allowed the Columbia Heights subdivision to be proposed in 1910. But as a result, we saw a year later 30 state parks, the first of 30 state parks created in the Gorge, 26 in Oregon and 4 in Washington. A year later, there was a Mount Hood National Park proposed, but it didn't go anywhere. It was just for the Oregon side, but there was political opposition. 20 years later, Bonneville Dam was completed, and people started talking about the Gorge, started calling it the Pittsburgh of the West, because there was cheap energy, there was access to cheap energy now, so new development proposals would come in, and of course that spurred protection efforts. In 1937, Interstate Park was proposed. It went nowhere. There was quite a bit of Washington opposition to it. In the 1950s, Oregon and Washington Gorge Commissions were formed, but they're not the commissions we have today. They were separate state commissions, and they were advisory only. In 1970, 20 years later, a national recreation area was proposed, but that again went nowhere, primarily because of opposition in Washington state. In the 1970s, though, the biggest threat to certainly the western part of the Gorge occurred when the I-205 bridge was being considered. This bridge would have linked Mount Pleasant, Cape Horn, all the lands on the Washington side up to Beacon Rock within easy access. Again, it was that access to downtown Portland, a relatively easy commute. So there was a real threat there, and conservationists scrambled to try to figure out how to address this threat. And a group called the Columbia Gorge Coalition formed. Chuck Williams was outside tonight. I saw Dennis and Bonnie White. They were two of the biggest drivers behind the Columbia Gorge Coalition that did a wonderful job in getting the National Park Service involved. And the Park Service came out with a study that noted the Gorge has a possibility of fulfilling a need for an urban park area that would be nationally significant. And 4 years later, the Park Service came out with a study of alternatives. And this study of alternatives mentioned very alarming threats that were happening in the Gorge, particularly the Western Gorge, from a development standpoint. And it proposed 4 different alternatives to deal with these threats. The first alternative was essentially existing policies, and the last alternative was direct federal management. And in between, there was a commission and several other things.
But at least now there was a sense of the direction that needed to be taken to see long-lasting, hopefully permanent protection of the gorge happen. But what there wasn't was a leader. And John Yon, who is a noted Portland architect, set out to find that leader. John was, many people credit him with the Northwest style of architecture. He was a son of the historic Columbia River Highway. His father was a roadmaster, rather, of the historic Columbia River Highway. He served for $1 a year and built the highway, and his son ended up loving the gorge as much. He was the owner of a place called the Shire, which is this beautiful property right across from Multnomah Falls. And you can see it from the interstate, very manicured grounds leading right down to the river. And John set about, he wanted to talk with Nancy Russell about helping protect the gorge, because there was no concerted effort at that point. There were clear threats, there was a potential solution, but there was nobody to lead it. And John called Nancy and her husband Bruce and invited them out to dinner at the Shire one night. And he proposed it for 2 weeks down in the future. And Nancy and Bruce said fine, and the day before the dinner was to take place, John canceled it and scheduled it for 30 days out. And they said fine, and they went, and they were ready to go, rather, 30 days later, but John called up about 3 weeks into it and canceled it again. And finally, they had the dinner at the Shire. And the reason John had canceled all the previous dinner appointments was because he wanted the moon to be rising right above Multnomah Falls, which you saw. He had planned everything, and John was an absolute perfectionist. And he set about wooing Nancy to lead this effort. And Nancy, who could resist the moon over the gorge and the moon over Multnomah Falls? Nancy agreed to lead the effort. And Nancy is a Portland homemaker, mother of 4. She was a wildflower history enthusiast. She was a member of the garden club. She was an absolutely remarkable woman, but she had no political or fundraising or organizing experience. But in every way, she was perfect to lead this effort. She had passion for the gorge, she had energy, she was incredibly smart, and she was tenacious. She was as persistent a person as you can imagine. We don't have time tonight for me to tell you stories about when I was at Friends of the Columbia Gorge or later at Trust for Public Land, when Nancy would come up with some great idea that would take years to implement. And I would get a call from her the next day, about 12 hours later, to ask what progress I had made on this particular idea, which normally was no progress whatsoever. And she was a strong person, and she needed to be strong, as it turned out, given how the legislation unfolded. But Nancy, with the help of Don Clark, who was a Multnomah County executive, very savvy political person, very generous, thoughtful, and close to Senator Hatfield, helped Nancy create Friends of the Columbia Gorge. And Nancy had a pretty direct mission. And Senator Hatfield was the one who really gave it to her and said, you need to build an army of citizens. And it's got to be a diverse army of citizens. It's got to be urban, it has to be rural. You've got to get people from Portland, Vancouver, Seattle, the Gorge. It's got to be Oregonians and Washingtonians, Republicans and Democrats. So Nancy went about building that army. And she did it through this incredible slideshow that started out mostly about wildflowers, and then eventually kind of left the wildflowers behind and turned almost exclusively into what needed to be done to protect the gorge. But we used to joke at Friends of the Columbia Gorge that we had to buy these projector bulbs by the dozen because Nancy would burn them out about every week. It seemed every time you had 2 or 3 people together, Nancy would be there and she would be ready to show the slideshow. But the challenges faced by this fledgling organization really can't be overstated. All of you, I think, know this. Of course, the Gorge has 2 states. It's got 6 counties. It's got, I think, 7 port districts. It had 9 towns and villages, about a dozen urban areas. At that point, there were 41,000 people living in the Gorge, 50 different entities with legal jurisdiction, including the 4 Columbia River Treaty tribes. There were development threats at the federal level, at the state level, at local levels. Federal legislation was clearly needed. You could only protect this area, bi-state area, given all the diverse threats to it through federal legislation. But there wasn't a lot of time, and the history didn't offer encouragement. For the last 50 years, there had been at least half a dozen efforts for federal legislation to protect the gorge that failed miserably. They really never got off the ground. And yet here was a threat. We've got the I-205 bridge. It was completed in 1982, and suddenly the lands in the western gorge, particularly western Skamania County on the Washington side, were absolutely threatened. These lands were gently sloping, southern exposure, there was river access. They were almost exclusively private lands, unlike what we had on the Oregon side, which tended to be steeper, of course, northern exposure, and a lot of public lands, at least in the western gorge. Skamania County at that point was unzoned. There was no zoning. And it now had an easy commute to Portland. So again, you saw this pattern unplaying of easy access leading to development efforts, leading to efforts of protection. And all these lands were held by a handful of families that were led by a half a dozen elderly patriarchs. And I remember when I was with Trust for Public Land going and trying to negotiate a conservation easement over these lands in the Mount Pleasant area from one of these patriarchs. And I asked him what he did as a young man to earn a living. And he said he hunted mountain lions. And that was news to me. Where? And he said, well, right around here. And Washington had about a $5 bounty on mountain lions, but there were so many that this man could make a living hunting mountain lions in the western gorge. And he was only 80-some years old. So it showed you that the landscape could change really in the blink of an eye, because that was a very wild place back then. And as you can see now, it's much more transformed in a short period to a very pastoral setting. And I kept thinking, well, boy, if it can change that quickly, what's the next change going to be? Particularly with the I-205 bridge, and especially with the unzoned lands in Skamania County. So what Nancy did, and it really was Nancy's effort the whole time, was to get the Trust for Public Land to come in and to try to buy some critical properties that were imminently threatened by development, because legislation wasn't going to happen overnight, if it was going to happen at all. And this put the Trust for Public Land in a very risky position. Trust for Public Land is a nonprofit based in San Francisco. Its objective is to buy important private lands and put them into public ownership for public parks, working lands, that sort of thing. But typically TPL works where there's an agency that wants to buy land and where there's funding so the agency can buy the land from TPL once it buys it. And that wasn't the case in the Gorge. There was a beginning effort to get legislation passed, but it was only that. And again, the track record over the past 50 years didn't give a lot of confidence that there eventually was going to be a public steward with funds to buy any lands that TPL bought. But nevertheless, with Nancy's leadership, TPL went in and started buying land. One of the most important acquisitions was the Riser subdivision directly across from Multnomah Falls. This came up, it was 60 acres. In 1980, Skamania County approved a 24-lot short plat subdivision, which essentially, because there was no zoning in Skamania County, what you could do is you could divide your land into 4 parcels or fewer, and you didn't need to go through any sort of public process. So what Colonel Riser did and other landowners was he took his land and he said, okay, I'm going to divide it into 4 pieces. I'm going to give 1 to my daughter, my son, my wife, and then they're going to give 2 to their friends, and then all of them are going to divide their land into 4 parcels. And pretty soon I've got a 24-lot a short plat subdivision that didn't need any sort of public approval at all. So that's what he did, and the Friends of the Columbia Gorge went ahead and litigated, and they won, but on procedural grounds, so it was a temporary victory. So as soon as Colonel Riser was able to go back and comply with the state subdivision law, everything was going to be fine, and there was going to be a new 24-lot subdivision across from Multnomah Falls. Well, Trust for Public Land came in and acquired the property in 1983, again, with no real hope that they were going to be able to pass this on to public ownership. Just downriver, there was a Rimview Estates subdivision, which was a 12-lot short plat approved on 45 acres the exact same time. So we were seeing these developments happen because of the I-205 bridge. And that was also approved by Skamania County. It was the exact same issue. It was the same legal issue that the Friends won on temporarily with the Reiser subdivision. But the Friends at that point had just started, and they didn't have the finances to actually litigate two cases at the same time. So Nancy and Bruce Russell borrowed $300,000, loaned it to TPL, and in 1983, TPL acquired all but one lot. That lot had unfortunately been sold to a private landowner who ended up putting in a large estate on the property. But still, it was a significant victory. Going back upriver for a second, in 1983, an 83-lot subdivision was approved on 78 acres right across from Horsetail Falls. And it was, we asked the landscape architect firm Walker Macy to do a mock-up for us of what the property would look like if it were developed according to the plans that were approved. And so they did this, again, right across from Multnomah Falls. The Friends litigated before the State Shoreline Hearings Board, and they won. And it was, again, though, a temporary victory on procedural grounds. And TPL again came in and acquired the property so it wouldn't be developed. And it wasn't just subdivisions that were worrisome. In Clark County, at the far western end of the gorge on the Washington side, the Steigerwald Lake property, almost 700 acres, were zoned heavy industry. The Friends objected, TPL came in and acquired, and turned what would have been an extension of the plant there right now, the wood products plant. It's a new national wildlife, just in a really short period of time. Again, just within 5 years, it went from heavy industry to TPL buying to eventually conveying to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for a new national wildlife refuge. And this also fit into Nancy's strategy of protecting, in particular, the entrances to the gorge, to make sure that when you drove across the Sandy River or Gibbons Creek or the Deschutes River, that you were in a place very different from what you had left behind. So this was the first purchase of a gateway. The same thing happened with the Sandy River Delta right across the river on the Oregon side, about 1,400 acres, proposed marina and golf course. TPL came in, acquired the property, eventually was able to convey it to the Forest Service, and now it's one of Maya Lynn's confluence projects. For anyone who hasn't been out there, it's really worth the hike. It's the only flat hike that I'm aware of, just about in the Columbia Gorge. But you get to the end and you have this beautiful bird blind put together by Maya Lynn that has each plank shows the species that were on this property when Lewis and Clark came through. It gives their Latin name and it gives their status. Threatened and endangered is the case with most of those species. But it's a remarkable property. Moving east, Miller Island, about an 800-acre island, absolutely sacred to the four Columbia River Treaty Tribes. It was a village site, it was a burial site, and it was threatened by grave robbing, quarrying, and grazing. So TPL stepped in and acquired that. And in the Columbia Hills, a few years later, just a little bit downriver on the Washington side, a remarkable 6,000-acre property, extraordinary resources owned by a wonderful farmer called Pat Bleakney, who ended up being on the Gorge Commission. Pat ended up selling it to the Trust for Public Land, and TPL eventually put it into public ownership, half of it going to Washington State Parks, and the lower half going to Washington DNR. So the Trust for Public Land, the successes in the Gorge were absolutely remarkable. They ended up, to date, TPL has acquired 83 properties, about 17,000 acres, worth about $35 million. And most of this was done when there was no federal steward and there was no federal legislation. TPL took an enormous risk. They raised, through Nancy's help, about $1.5 million and used that to leverage other funding and acquired about $35 million of land. And in particular, in the western gorge on the Washington side, those lands were so threatened. TPL came in and virtually eliminated the threat. So at the same time TPL was doing this, the Friends of the Gorge were focusing on legislation. And Senator Packwood held the first hearing in Hood River in February 1983. The battle lines were quickly drawn from the people who were invited to testify. We were mostly elected officials. You had elected officials and Friends of the Columbia Gorge that wanted the strongest possible legislation, which meant a federal agency managing the gorge. And then you had people who wanted absolutely no legislation whatsoever. And it was just, couldn't have been a clearer demarcation. A few weeks later, Senator Packwood introduced Senate Bill 627, which had the Forest Service manage the gorge with the assistance of an advisory commission. But even with that bill, there was no Washington support, none whatsoever. A month later, Senator Hatfield held his first hearing in Portland. Public testimony was invited, and Senator Hatfield got quite a bit of public testimony. 7 hours, 54 witnesses. The two governors, though, announced at that hearing that they had reached an agreement on how the gorge should be protected. And the governors said what they wanted was a 23-person commission to manage the gorge. And I don't know those of you who have sat on committees before, but you know once you get more than a few people, it's very difficult to accomplish anything. But can you imagine managing the gorge with a 23-person commission, subject to 22 principles and I think 8 key elements? One of the Columbia Gorge United, which was the organization that spearheaded the opposition to the legislation, said the difference between the governor's bill and Senator Packwood's bill was the difference between being taken over by Polish troops or Russian troops. And Skamania County had a particularly forceful response. They said, okay, they called it, the chairman, Bill Benson, called it a misbegotten agreement that might seem benign when you first look at it, but once it went through the houses of Congress, Friends of the Gorge, National Audubon, and others, they will have accomplished their original goal to put Skamania County under an onerous, unreasonable, unheeding, uncaring, unfeeling, unthinkable bureaucracy, which will toll the death knell for life as we know and love it. So again, you had two very different sides, and the governor's bill did not do anything to reach a political middle. You still had people who wanted strong legislation and people who wanted no legislation whatsoever. I think the only entity that actually supported the governor's bill were the two separate gorge commissions that had been appointed by the governor. So there wasn't much to build on at that point. But probably the real turning point as far as field hearings occurred about 18 months later in Stevenson. And there had been two very important transitions from elected officials. Senator Scoop Jackson had passed away, and he was replaced by Dan Evans. And Dan Evans had solid conservation credentials and experience. And the Washington governor, John Spellman, was replaced by Booth Gardner. And Booth Gardner had been elected just days before. And it was a tumultuous hearing. You walked in, and there were hundreds of people just absolutely crammed into the Rock Creek Auditorium. And most of them were wearing buttons that said, "Save the Gorge from Nancy Russell," or "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's gorge." And it was a raucous event. It went on for 14 hours. There were 125 witnesses. It literally went on till midnight. When Booth Gardner's representative got up to speak, there were some catcalls and boos, and then he started going into his testimony, and his testimony said, we want federal legislation as soon as possible. We want the gorge tributaries to be protected as wild and scenic river areas, and we want to see very strong interim protection. We want a moratorium on development. And at that point, the boos and hisses turned into just absolute pandemonium. The rafters were shaking, and the hearing had to be stopped for a few minutes, but it went on. When Nancy and I left that hearing at about, again, midnight, we walked out to our car, and the car, 3 of the tires had been slashed. And it was particularly unfortunate for Nancy's sister because we had anticipated something like this might happen, so we asked Betsy if we could borrow her car. And sure enough, they saw it coming. So now we've gone through the field hearings that had happened through 83, 84. Senate workshop was held in 1985. It was a way to look at maps to try to change the conversation to lower the decibel level. And that worked pretty well. You got people around maps, you got them talking about things, you tried to get them away from the issues of condemnation and things like that. And it worked well until one of Senator Evans' aides, by mistake, sent out a map to be looked at by everyone with one of the notes said areas of potential acquisition. And as you can imagine, that did not go over well, but it was a temporary blip. And there were then 2 Washington, D.C. hearings that were held in June of '86. So Congress now is near their summer recess and at the end of the session. So the challenge was, how do you move one of 4 bills that have been introduced in Congress through 3 committees and 2 subcommittees before the scheduled October 3rd adjournment date? So there was very little time to do this. And the Gorge legislation was, as you know, extremely controversial. In the Senate, there was considerable opposition, and it was led by some of the most powerful senators. Jim McClure, who was the chairman from Idaho of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, was particularly opposed to it, as was Malcolm Wallop, who chaired a key subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee. And generally moving a controversial bill through the Senate under the best of circumstances is almost impossible, because one senator can essentially stand up and hold the entire process. But in the waning days of the session, it's almost always impossible. The difference, though, was Senator Hatfield. And Senator Hatfield was chairman of Appropriations. And as I'm sure many of you know, Appropriations is the most powerful committee in Congress. And Senator Hatfield was more than happy to use that power. And what he did every time there was a roadblock was he would go to the floor of the Senate and ask for unanimous consent for that roadblock to be removed. And we saw him do it time and time again. You had people like Jim McClure saying, this is the most remarkable process I have ever seen. But not one senator was willing, despite this great opposition to the legislation, was willing to stand in Senator Hatfield's way. So while there was controversy in the Senate, it was a pretty, reasonable, decorous event. Whereas you got to the House, and it was just, again, total pandemonium. It made the Stevenson hearing look sophisticated. The House Republican strategy was to essentially bottle the bill up in committee. And again, the waning days of the congressional session. So what the Republicans would do is they would send one representative to each committee meeting, and the sole responsibility of that representative was to raise his hand and to say, I've got amendments to offer, and offer the First Amendment. And then there wouldn't be a quorum, which generally is the case in Congress, but particularly the case in the last few days of the session, especially before an election year. And so they would have to stop the proceedings, go out, find a quorum, come back, vote on the amendment, and this would just happen time and time again. In the Agriculture Committee, it took 3 hours to go through 2 pages of the 78-page Gorge bill before the chairman just said, I can't do this anymore, we're recessing. So it was a very successful strategy. It was successful until Representative Denny Smith from Oregon was 15 minutes late to an Interior Committee meeting. And the Democrats took advantage of that. They passed the bill out of committee before he was there because no other Republicans would show up. They passed it, and he came 15 minutes later, and the look on his face, knowing what had happened, because there was absolute jubilation in the committee rule. Congressmen from California, from Arizona, from New Jersey, who had never heard of the Columbia Gorge, were just so delighted to have outfoxed the Republicans finally, that they were all cheering and slapping Jim Weaver on the back saying, save the gorge. And then Denny Smith came and got into a pretty ugly argument with John Seiberling, who was chairman of Interior at that point. But nevertheless, the bill passed, all 5 lines of it, through the committee. So now the objective was, how do we get this to the House floor? There are 2 days to adjournment. How do we get it to the House floor so that it could be voted on? Because we were pretty confident when we got to the floor of the House, we'd be able to get the legislation passed. The only way to do that was to go through the House Rules Committee, and they weren't scheduled to meet. But Congressman Weaver was able to get the chairman, Claude Pepper, to agree to an unusual meeting of the Rules Committee, and they met in the last 2 days of the session and met to decide whether they would take the bill to the floor of the House. And Congressman Bob Smith from this district objected to the rule. He said, listen, I've still got 50 amendments that I want to offer. You can't pass a rule that's saying there's going to be limited debate. So the Rules Committee heard him out, and the Rules Committee agreed. So that was it. There was no hope at that point of passing legislation. The session was going to end. Congressman Weaver said to us, go home, chances of passage are nil. So I packed up, went back to the hotel, packed up, called a cab, and was just about to head out to the airport when I got a call from Congressman Weaver's office saying, come back, that the Speaker Foley has persuaded the Rules Committee to reconsider its decision this morning. But the House rules required a lapse of a single legislative day between the rule and the debate, just part of the arcane rules of the House. And the adjournment was in 48 hours. So what to do? Well, what to do was to have the Rules Committee meet at midnight and consider a rule. And the Republicans tried the same thing. They went in at midnight. They were going to object to lack of quorum, but there was a quorum because the Democrats had anticipated that. The rule was passed out at 1 in the morning, and on the last full day of the 99th Congress, the entire House of Representatives met to debate the Gorge bill on the floor of the House. The debate lasted 4 hours and 15 minutes. Again, this is the last full day of the session. There had been a Wall Street Journal editorial out that morning that said, stop Congress's national adjournment part. And the level of discourse didn't get much higher than that in the 4 hours and 15 minutes. The House voted, though, 290 to 91 to pass the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area Act. But now, which is exactly the way we felt until we realized we had to pass it through the Senate. And there was only 1 day left. So the Senate repassed that bill that afternoon by unanimous consent. Senator Hatfield went to the floor of the Senate and said, we've got this bill out of the House. I move that it be unanimously approved by the Senate. So only one senator, again, all he had to do was raise his hand or her hand and say, I object, and there would be no national scenic area. But nobody wanted to incur the wrath of Senator Hatfield, so the bill passed Congress. It passed the Senate. And that's still not the end, though. Skamania County declared a time of mourning. It flew the flag at half-mast. It declared a mourning period for the entire county. And then it published an article saying President Reagan is key to saving Columbia Gorge people from bill. So the Columbia Gorge people needed to be saved from this legislation. But the pioneer was right in that there was a 30-day period where President Reagan had to sign the bill or it would die of a pocket veto. Veto recommendations came in from 3 agencies, the Office of Management Budget, Department of Justice, Department of Interior. Only the Department of Agriculture recommended that President Reagan sign the bill. We had hoped that President Reagan, the balance of the Senate was in jeopardy for the Republicans. There was a 1 senator margin, I think. And we had hoped that President Reagan would see signing the Gorge bill as something that was good for Senator Gorton, who was one of the Washington senators who ended up coming on board the legislation. And Senator Gordon needed help in Seattle, and we thought, well, Senator Gordon can talk about the National Scenic Area Act, something that was popular in Seattle, and it might help him in re-election, which might help President Reagan, of course, sign the bill before then. But that didn't happen. And Senator Gordon lost his re-election. Day 29 came and went, and finally, President Reagan signed the Columbia Gorge bill. It was the only standalone environmental legislation passed during the Reagan presidency. Senator Hatfield maintains that President Reagan signed it with his right hand and held his nose with his left hand. I don't know if that is true or not, but that's what he maintains. And Senator Hatfield never spoke about what convinced President Reagan to sign the legislation. And several people who were close to the senator thought that he had gone to President Reagan and said, I know Star Wars is your most important defense bill, and I want you to know that I'm on the fence about Star Wars. Now, on the other hand, the Columbia Gorge National Scenic Area Act is something I care a great deal about. I don't know if that's true. But the bottom line is this legislation never would have happened were it not for Senator Hatfield. And Senator Hatfield from the beginning was a supporter, was an incredibly intelligent strategist, crafter of legislation, and he used his power as chairman of appropriations, as we've all read over the course of the last couple of weeks. He was willing to use that power for something he believed in. And Nancy Russell, this never would have happened without Nancy's incredible passion for the gorge, her intimate knowledge of the gorge, of her willingness to suffer the slings and arrows of being in the middle of a public fight, even though nothing in her background had prepared her for that. And Nancy's incredible tenacity and persistence. And I just want to end on one last note, which is a postscript. I talked earlier about Rimview Estates, the property that was approved for a short plat subdivision that the Russells borrowed $300, loaned to TPL, and TPL had used to acquire all but one lot. And that lot was a large house was constructed on that lot. Well, 25 years after TPL bought bought all the subdivision but this one lot, it negotiated the purchase of the last lot and assigned its option to Friends of the Columbia Gorge. And Friends of the Columbia Gorge went out and raised the money to acquire this property, to tear the house down, and to build a scenic overlook in memory of Nancy Russell. So instead of this house now on top of Cape Horn, you have this, a viewing platform. And that was just dedicated in Nancy's name at a beautiful ceremony last Saturday. So it helps to be persistent. Thank you.